Welcome to the Miami-Dade College Journalism Speaker Series. I'm your host, Manolo Barco. Joining us today is Patricia Mazzei from the New York Times. Patricia, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Patricia, tell us a little about your time at the New York Times. You're currently the bureau chief for the paper, right?
Yeah, I started about a year and a half ago, and it's been busy. We've had a lot of death and destruction, sadly. We do a lot of breaking news on the national desk of the New York Times, and so that means we cover hurricanes and tornadoes and shootings and bridges that fall. But we also get to, go around the state and tell the stories of people who maybe normally wouldn't have a national audience. So that's been a real pleasure for me in this job.
So, and then you oversee the bureau, so you're working with a lot of former Herald folks as well, right? Audra Birch and Francis Robles. Talk to me a little bit about having a team. It's a small team, but it's a very big area that you guys cover.
Yes, and we're colleagues. I'm not their boss or anything like that, but it's nice to have people who go way back with you. We've known each other for years. We've covered all sorts of stories together from when we worked at the Herald. And now at the Times, with people you've worked with before, you have the same language that you all go back to. You've all been trained the same way. The Miami Herald still has this philosophy of when there's a big breaking story, you just throw everything at it, right? And everybody drops everything they're doing and chases the breaking story. And I think that's how Audra and Frenchie and I work together here. When there's a big story in Florida, it's all hands on deck and we all help each other out.
And how different is it than being at the Miami Herald? I guess your zone has expanded as far as your coverage area.
Yeah, I cover geography now. So I write about Florida and Puerto Rico. I don't cover just one issue. So before at the Herald, I used to write about politics. And at the Times, I cover some politics too. Last year, there was a midterm election, and I was involved in that. But it's more just whatever the big story of the day is. And in a way, that gives you a sort of good perspective. When you're just covering politics, it's very easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, whatever the latest driving the day scandal is. And then if you're in the middle of an election, you have to cover a hurricane, right? It shifts your perspective as to, this is really important and it's happening and affecting a lot of people's lives, and we can stay away from the Twitter alerts for a while and write about something else that it also really matters.
You were born in Venezuela, correct?
Yes.
How is it covering, everything that's happening there, the upheaval in Venezuela? It's hard probably not to be personal for you in some ways. I'm not, obviously you're objective.
Well, I don't cover it in my job, and at the Herald I occasionally had to pitch in, mostly because the Venezuela story, like the Cuba story and the Haiti story, are local stories in Miami and South Florida, right? We have the biggest population of Cubans outside of Cuba, of Haitians outside of Haiti, and Venezuelans outside of Venezuela. So at the Times, I've really only had to write about sort of the Venezuelan American community here and how it might be affected by policy that the U.S. gets involved in or doesn't, how it might affect American politics to have Venezuelans here. And I think it's important to have a diverse staff in a newspaper that is able to cover the communities that aren't always or haven't traditionally maybe been represented in national media. You want a staff that is bilingual, that comes from different countries. I mean, the Times has people, I think, in more than 160 countries, and that speak, 50 languages, and you want that because that just helps people have a voice that maybe, if you're not reading the Miami Herald, you might not be aware that there's a bunch of Venezuelan Americans in South Florida.
Talk to me a little bit about the travel. I think I read somewhere that you've been to almost 20, maybe it might be 20 countries during your reporting. How tough is it to parachute is the wrong word, but go into a place where you're not familiar and kind of get familiar really quick, and you're expected to turn a story around?
Well, I haven't done reporting from that many countries, though I've visited them. I have done reporting from various countries, and I think it's actually quite similar to going to another state or city that you don't know, because you have to tell people about a place that you don't live in, right, and you're not intimately familiar with. But as a reporter, you're sort of trained to be able to become a pseudo-expert very quickly on an issue. And so what you do is you find people who can show you around. I mean, the people who know the place well. I talk about them as being the mayors of a place, even if they're not the actual mayor with the title, but you want to go to a town and have someone who can almost hold your hand and introduce you to the locals. And that's true abroad, and it's true in the US. I remember after Hurricane Michael, traveling various towns in the Florida Panhandle, and they were still flooded, right? This was like the day after the storm. And in one of them, we came across two women on a golf cart who were making the rounds in this small town to see if all their friends and neighbors were okay. And they saw us, and they saw that we looked sort of like lost reporters, you know, with cameras and stuff. And they said, do you want to come with us? We'll give you a ride in the golf cart, and we'll show you around the town. And that's what you want, because then somebody's telling you, hey, let me show you what matters to me, and I live here. And I can tell you this didn't look like this before the hurricane, right? Because if I show up, I don't know if this street was always flooded, right? So it's really important to make those connections and let the locals trust you.
And what is the best way for a young reporter to do that? How do you make someone comfortable? I hear a lot of times students say, I'm not comfortable, I feel awkward, or I feel like I'm intrusive. What is the best advice you can give to a young reporter?
I think that's a good question, and I think it depends a little on everyone's personality. Some people are not comfortable sharing anything about themselves in an interview, and I think you learn with time that it's important to make that human connection with somebody. And so if you find common ground, even if that means sharing something about yourself, that's fine. You know, even though you're the person doing the interview, it doesn't mean that you're like this alien box that doesn't share anything about yourself. But I also think it's important to remember that most people really want to tell you their story. Most people really want to talk about what is important to them, and we're privileged to be able to give people a way to tell their stories. And so I think if you reach people kindly and politely, and maybe not at the worst possible time, although we certainly make a lot of phone calls at the worst possible time for people, and you say, you know, I'm very sorry that you lost someone, for example. We often have to call the families of victims of something, but I want to be able to properly honor your loved one, right? You want to give them that sort of dignity and not just have third-hand information about this person. And people want to tell you that. And so I'm always amazed at how much people want to talk to reporters, because people want to tell their version of events and they want to tell their stories. And we have to remember that we are the conduit of that.
And people can tell when you're being genuine, when you're interested in them, or they're just a story.
Right. If you're not listening, and if you're making it about yourself, then that's not going to be a very effective interview technique.
And we'll return in a couple of minutes with Patricia Mazzei of the New York Times.
Start your story at MDC. Be analytical. Be imaginative. Be a rising star. Be bold. Be connected. Be the solution. Be ready. What's your story? Be the best. Be you. Be MDC.
Welcome back to the Miami-Dade College Journals and Speaker Series. I'm Manolo Barco. Today we're here with Patricia Mazzei from New York Times. Patricia, welcome back.
Thank you.
Patricia, can you talk to us a little bit about, so you worked at the Miami Herald, you made a big name for yourself covering politics. That was a big part of what you did at the Herald. Talk to us a little bit about your time covering politics, and I'm sure you encountered a lot of interesting characters.
It was a fun beat. You know, I started out covering local, city, county, school board, government, and then eventually just congressional campaigns, and then Senate campaign, governor, you know, and the presidential campaign in 2016. It was a really busy time. We had a lot of candidates coming down here, and at some point, you know, every reporter was covering a candidate visiting in town. Even if they weren't covering politics, we were just sort of dividing and conquering. And because we had a couple of Florida candidates running for the Republican nomination, the paper invested in sending me to Iowa and New Hampshire to cover Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush. And that helped sort of tell our readers who knew these men from the start of their political careers what the rest of the country was seeing them as, what they were learning about them. And it felt like a great way to tie the presidential race that was like a big national story to the local audience in the local paper.
How tough is it keeping, you know, a lot of people, a lot of time, for example, I'll give you an example. One of our students, he's into politics. And when he first started with us, he would tweet stuff about politics. And we're like, you know, this is something that you could be covering. You know, this is probably not a good practice for you to have. How tough is it to remain, unbiased and not having a perspective on a particular thing?
I mean, I'm a reporter first, I don't care, nobody cares what I think about matters of policy, nor do I really. I mean, what matters is what the policymakers and people running for office think. And as a reporter, your credibility lies on being able to write those stories and report them accurately. And so, whatever you're going to tweet or put on Facebook, if you're choosing to be a reporter, you choose to give up that part of you that is just going to say whatever you want on social media, because it doesn't help you. I think everybody comes with their own stories and biases, and what's important as a reporter is to be able to report fairly and accurately and give people a chance to say what they have to say, regardless of what your personal history is or your personal ideas. I don't write opinion columns. I don't write editorials. I am there to sort of analyze, based on my experience, what a person running for office is saying, but it's just not my place to say what I think, and nobody's electing me for anything. Doesn't matter,
So you went to the University of Miami, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us about your time there? How was that experience? What are some of your biggest learning experiences that you had?
Well, I didn't know I wanted to be a reporter, so I figured that out while I was a student there, because the college paper was hiring reporters, and I thought this might be fun, and I needed an on-campus job. And it was just a great way to find out about the university. You felt like you knew what was going on at a much more granular level than I was before I was in the school paper. It gives you an excuse to go up to someone and ask questions and be curious. I always say that I get paid to be nosy. That is my job, and it's great because people know that that's an important part of our society and of keeping institutions accountable. And so I could just go up to an administrator at the university who otherwise I would have never talked to and ask them important questions about what was going on at the school. So that's where I got bitten by the bug working as a student journalist, and then I picked up a minor in print journalism and started, freelancing while I was still a student, and that's how I got started.
What are some of the stories you wrote? What are topics that you wrote about where you
Well, Facebook was just getting started at the time, and it was only for college students, and it was a real learning curve for people to realize that all their information was online and public to anybody who had access to it. And we wrote a pretty big story about people sort of breaking campus rules and posting pictures about it on the internet, and then like us writing about it. And it was a real important legal question about, can we report on this? It's students' privacy, but it's online, so of course we could. Like, we were absolutely within our rights to do it, but the kids involved didn't know. And I think it was a lesson for everybody that, in retrospect, was more important than we thought, which was sort of the end of privacy for what people would have normally considered just like college shenanigans.
And was it tougher, because UM is a private university as opposed to a public institution, was it tougher being a student journalist at a private school?
Well, you certainly didn't have the backup of Florida's very robust public records laws to help you get information. So I think we didn't have the same level of documents that you could have at a public university, and I wish we had that. On the other hand, they did open events to student journalists, like trustee meetings and things like that, which we were grateful for, but it's definitely not the same as having access to public records. That's like really the crown jewel for any journalist.
And the Herald was your first job out of college, your first professional job?
Yeah, it was. I started freelancing for them my senior year.
And what was your first beat covering?
I covered the village of Key Biscayne. And so I covered their village council meetings, which in some cases went until 2 o'clock in the morning. And that was my little municipal beat. That was as a freelancer. Then when they hired me part-time, I covered other cities, Palmetto Bay, Cutler Bay, later also Pinecrest, Homestead, and then the Broward School District, the city of Miami, Miami-Dade County, a bunch of government.
A lot of people say that's not glamorous, but I'm sure that you learned a lot during that time.
Well, I think as a young reporter, it's important to learn where you gravitate to. The fun part about journalism is that you can have many different beats over the course of your career. You don't have to just be a sports reporter or just be a news reporter. You can sort of jump from one place to the other. But I learned early on that, for example, what I liked was government and politics. And being able to do that, there was just so many options. I mean, you could do cops, you could do courts, you could do politics. So I think you have to be open to all of them, but also realize that, oh, maybe feature writing is not my favorite thing. Maybe my favorite thing is actually writing about politicians and what they do and they don't want you to know about.
And if you look at yourself maybe 5 years ago, what are the things that you feel you've improved in at the most?
God, I think one of the great things about the profession is that you're always learning about subjects that you didn't know. You know, you have to learn. One day they assigned you a story about, a couple of weeks ago they assigned me a story about a referendum on hallucinogenic mushrooms in Denver. And for that day, I learned everything there was to know about that. You know what I mean? And so I would have not told you that I would know anything about that, even 3 weeks ago. But I think skills-wise, I think you're always becoming a better writer. You're always becoming a better interviewer, and you're always perfecting your methods of getting information, be it like writing better records requests or finding better sources, right? Like nurturing relationships with people so that over time they become your sources. I think that doesn't ever stop.
Perfect. All right, well, we're going to take a momentary break and we'll return with Patricia Mazzei of the New York Times.
Start your story at MDC. Be analytical. Be imaginative. Be a rising star. Be bold. Be connected. Be the solution. Be ready. What's your story? Be the best. Be you. Be MDC.
Welcome back to the Miami-Dade College Journalism Speaker Series. I'm Manolo Barco. Today we're here with Patricia Mazzei from the New York Times. Welcome back, Patricia. Can you tell us a little bit about how you keep yourself motivated and fresh? It's a career that can be very rigorous, and talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think burnout is a real problem in reporting, especially when you cover a lot of dismal stories where there's just a lot of sadness involved in tragedy, which is a lot of what we do in breaking news, unfortunately. And I think it's important that editors and managers in general are aware of that and give people sort of the time and space to recover after big stories. It's really sometimes up to an editor to sort of hear your voice on the phone and tell you, like, maybe you've been there too long, 10 days in a disaster zone or something, like maybe you need a break, even if it means just a day off in the disaster zone, not reporting. So reporters among each other, I think we try to be supportive, and it's good to have friends in the business that you can talk to about having a hard day, a hard week, being in a difficult story. I think it's important at the end of the day when you're out on assignment to have a meal and maybe touch base with someone from home, a friend, a family member, and get a good night's sleep. You can't always do it, but it really helps a lot. And so it sounds like those are just very basic things, but I think we forget sometimes in the adrenaline rush of a big breaking news story that you are of no use to your news organization if you burn out and can't work. So it's better to sort of pace yourself.
Yeah. We're all humans.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit. What advice would you give to a young journalist who's studying journalism right now? What advice would you give to them?
I still think it's one of the best jobs out there, and I know that it's been a tumultuous industry and that has maybe scared some people away from it. And I think the young journalists we see now are going to have different career paths than I did, right? I feel like I'm from the last generation that came up through covering hyper-local news, village councils. That's not something people get to cover a lot anymore, mostly because the industry has changed to the point where we have metrics and there's not a big online web audience for village council meetings. I thought that was like a graduate degree in journalism, to be able to start at the bottom and cover really small things, make your mistakes sort of at a smaller level and then work your way up. So I think it's like almost harder to be a younger reporter now, in that in some cases you get thrown right into the deep end of really tough stories when you haven't had a chance to maybe fully make your mistakes when the stakes are a little bit lower. But I encourage people who can't think of anything else that would make them happy, because that's how I fell into journalism. Like, this is exciting to me. I am happy to skip class for it. I'm happy to spend my free time on it. If you find something that you're passionate about that way, and journalism is that way for you, then I think you can definitely find a career in many ways that you couldn't before, because you can do presentation and graphics and videos in ways that maybe did not exist in the field. So you can have a different strength and still be part of the business, but you have to really want it. And it's still hard, but it's incredibly fulfilling.
How much pressure is there for you looking at, you are documenting history, and people will read your stories years from now and think this is what's happening back in 2019. How much pressure is that for you, and how do you deal with that?
I think we remember that we're the first draft of history, and that sometimes you can only tell the story as it is right now, knowing that it will change. You can only have like a small window into the truth at a given moment, and we have seen over time that you can have been wrong in terms of not the reporter saying something that was inaccurate, but the sources being wrong, right? The members of a government or in academia, just things change. So I don't think I try to think of myself like something that's going to be in a historical textbook. You think of like the best, most fair and accurate report we can have right now in the present, and look at every story that way. Or else I think, you're going to have insurmountable pressure on you.
So a lot of reporters are under attack these days. Is that something that's a source of frustration for you? I'm sure some people say, what exactly does a reporter do? How do you deal with that pressure?
Well, if people want to know more about what we do, then we should be very open and transparent about how and why we work the way we do. And I think the Times has been very invested in showing people, we have a column in the paper that's called Times Insider, where reporters write in first person, which we hate to do because we don't like to make it about us. But it's really helpful that you explain to someone the story behind the story and a little bit about how you got it and the emotional impact it had on you. And that, I think, gives people like a peek behind the curtain of how we work. We've also had a series of columns that explain things like op-eds and things that maybe in journalism we think everybody knows, but then you realize maybe a reader who just picks up the paper or sees it online doesn't actually know the difference between a news analysis piece, an opinion column, and straight news. So I think we should be very open about why we work the way we do, why we use the words we do, why we make the decisions that we make. And honestly, I think we're all pretty thick-skinned. Attacking the press has been around for as long as the press has been around.
What would you consider one of your more, not necessarily the biggest story that you've covered, but more interesting, unique, that maybe has left an impression on you?
During Hurricane Michael, we wrote a story about a house that had withstood the storm. And the way we got to that story was that an editor actually saw a picture that had been done of the coast of Mexico Beach in Florida and wondered how you could have all these flattened homes and then like just one just standing there. It was not the only one, but it stood out in this picture. And it seemed like a bit of a wild assignment, like how am I going to find the person who owns this house? And it came together very serendipitously that they were in the town the same day I was, looking through the wreckage, and we got access and talked to them. And it was a story about this house and the people behind it, but really it was a way to tell the story about the Florida Building Code, which is a very dry subject that most people would never click on. Like, this is a story about the Florida Building Code. But it managed to tell an important story about a hurricane, while making it personal. And even though, it might have seemed like just sort of a quirky hurricane story, I think it was a way to get people to care about a real disaster and think about it for the future. That just attracted a lot of readers, and I think that's important because you don't want to write a story that nobody reads.
So you humanized it.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about maybe the biggest mistake that you've made? Maybe biggest is the wrong way to phrase that. Maybe a mistake that you've made and what you learned from it. A lot of times, our mistakes are our biggest teachers. So talk to me a little bit about that and what you learned from a mistake maybe that you made.
I'm trying to think of a specific example. I remember thinking early on as a reporter that I had to be sort of standoffish with people, even in like confrontational interviews. And we do a lot of those. But I think over time you learn how to preserve the relationship you have with someone professionally, even while still asking them the tough questions. When you're a beat reporter and you're covering a government, for example, it does you no use if in your first week you upset, the manager of the city that you're covering. And I think I had to just learn that by doing it, that I can ask you difficult questions, that's my job, and your job is to answer them or not answer them, and the person can choose not to answer, which is very frustrating for you as a reporter. But you have to accept that and keep covering the beat and not let it become alienating, because if not, you're not serving your readers if you can't, keep going to city council meetings because they kick you out. So I don't have a specific example, but I think just the knowledge that you have to manage these relationships in a way that we're all professionals here, and my questions you might not like, but I'll come back with more questions tomorrow, and that's okay.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Patricia, for
Thanks for
joining
having
us
me.
today. And audience, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on MDC Journalism Speaker Series. Thank you for watching.